One thing I forgot to mention in last week. So I accept late papers, but you shouldn't do them. You should get them in on time. And your encouragement for getting them in on time is I will let you submit every paper for a redo on one condition. Anything you change has to be highlighted because I'm not going to read your whole paper again. All right. So a good example, paper one, a lot of students just forget that I need a final conclusion on your view of the industry. And that's a lot of points. And so they get back. So that's a pretty easy thing to add back in. So yeah, they can resubmit with that highlighted and they can get back in. I just need everything by the end of the semester so you have no semester. So you can just say, hey, I got to get this paper in. I know this part's weak, but I'll redo it. And the paper get easier at the end. You can do that. So I encourage you to get everything in on time. Then when you get the rubric back, you can see where your struggle is. You can meet with me. We can fix it. You're better off still meeting with me beforehand, just in case you're way off. I've had students, paper one is really a paper two. They talk about their company way too much, and paper one is like, no, paper one is an industry analysis. You could write your entire paper one and not mention your company once.
This is your.
So is that someone? So if you're on Zoom, make sure who's on Zoom? Alex, okay. All right, so any questions on that? So, I know this is a really hard class, so I'm trying not to, completely destroy your sense of a studenthood here. So, yeah, I mean, you picked a class that's really tough, but I will let you make up. I do get more incompletes on this class, which I hate more than anything because a lot of students with the incomplete and they never get back to finish it. So don't even think about that. Just get it done on time, submit for redos, and you'll be in good shape. So stay ahead of the curve. Don't procrastinate. All right. So what we want to do here is talk about some of these tools we have in finance that you should know. I'm going to talk about several of them tonight. Tools that you should know that are really powerful. They're the kind of things you probably want to bring up in an interview, but some of these you may have never seen before. We'll focus in on porters, but I'm going to talk about a few more of them as well. So what we're looking, this one's focused on economic moats. It's tied to porters. Economic moats is more your paper two, specific to the company, but there's a close link between economic moats and porters. So I'm going to talk about both of them here. But before we do that, here's two things you definitely want to know when you graduate. So we're going to do Porter's five forces and the generic strategies tonight. But I don't know how many of y'all have y'all had Porter's value chain in a class? Does that sound familiar? His books, I have his value chain book, and it's massive. It is really, I think I have his book, and I also did it on Audible, and this is a tough thing to do on Audible. It's not that he goes through his model. I mean, going through his model is fine, but then it's chapter after chapter after chapter of examples, and you really get worn out listening to all the examples. But the nice thing about Porter is he's so well known that if you just Google Porter's value chain, all kinds of websites are going to come up with good summaries of it. So it's pretty powerful stuff. So I'll do the five forces here. And I want to show you how you bring the generic strategies into your paper one, okay? So you can't graduate with a degree in finance and not be pretty proficient in Porter's. When I took Porter's, I think it was in a strategy class, and I thought, okay, I'll never see this again, and I just saw it all the time. I remember we were interviewing one manager, and the portfolio manager, she was talking about, this is how we look at the world, and she was giving us Porter's as if they came up with it. It's like, no, that's Porter. I didn't tell her, but I was like, yeah, that's Porter's. She's like, yeah, she may not have known it was Porter's. She might have thought her company came up with it and was doing it. So you hear it all the time. It's a pretty common way to talk. Usually, anytime you do an analysis, kind of a security analysis, they just almost expect a Porter's analysis in there. And so value chain, five forces, value chain is pretty important. So let's talk a little bit about value chain. How could you bring this in your paper? So Value chain is more paper 2 than paper 1, but you should think about it on paper 1. So you could probably Google your company's name and Porter's value chain, and you'd probably get something that would come up. I don't think MarketLine does a value chain analysis. I don't remember seeing that. But you can Google it. Be careful when you Google it that it's not some middle school student's paper. Make sure it's it's a good substantive paper. So what is value chain? So if you look at it, what Porter's asking is a really important question that you definitely want to think about in your paper 2. I'm not requiring a value chain in paper 2, but it'd be a good thing to add into paper 2. But you'd also have to think about it, how this works in your industry. So what he means by value chain is there's a process the company goes through, and at the end of it, they're doing something for a customer. And that whole process, some parts of the process add significant value. Other parts, they're just kind of doing it because they have to do it. Some parts they're really weak at and actually harms the process. So you want to look at each one of these pieces and say, okay, where does this firm really excel? Where are they average? And where are they weak? So a good example is it HelloFresh? So if you listen to their podcast, the guy who does that podcast, he says the CEO of their company says he wants to be Olympian in every part of their value chain. He wants to be off the charts strong in every part of the value chains. Now, is that possible? You could do every one of those well, but he says that's their goal. And so they actually have everybody's part value chains. They're looking at how they do there and can they be better. And his argument is, if you're an Olympic athlete and you're really good at things, but you have one muscle that you just pulled, you're not going to be a good athlete. So he said his argument, you can't be weak on anything. If you're going to be an Olympic athlete, you got to be strong on everything. So can he really be number one in all these things? Probably not, but he says that's their goal. So that's not a bad podcast to listen to because he talks quite a bit about value chain. So I don't know if you can see them in this picture. Let me expand it first. So you have the staff functions up here. So let's start down here. So you start off with the purchasing function. How important is the purchasing function? I think when we get to paper 2, I'm gonna show you. None of you are doing Costco, which is amazing to me. Costco is always a really popular one. But I'm going to show a video of the Costco CEO if I can find it again. He says Costco, they're limited SKU. Why are they limited SKU? They don't have 50,000 items. They just have a few thousand. And part of it is this inbound logistics. They're really going to be great at how they deal with their vendors. So that's stuff coming in. It's it's everything that brings all your raw materials into the firm. Then you have operations. That's where you're going to take the stuff that you purchase and you're going to somehow reformat it into a product for your customer. For Costco, there may not be much of that. The stuff's coming in, they just put it on the shelves, but that's still part of it. How does it get from the docks onto the shelves? And it's important, right? You don't want to be out of stock. You want to make sure you have the right reordering queues. Where do you store it? Costco's huge advantage is that their stores are their warehouses. That saves them a lot of money. Their stores are, to the roof, just stacked with stuff. Whereas a Walmart has what? A big warehouse on I-35. Those are important things. How does that add costs? How does it add time? How does it affect the customer? You have outbound logistics, your ordering process. So if you listen to the business breakdown for Peloton, think about Peloton. Talk about a disaster. 2020 hits, COVID. Guess what everybody wants? They want a Peloton in their house. Guess what Peloton can't do? Produce bikes. They mess up their process so much that they have all these orders coming in and they can't fill them. That's a disaster for a company, isn't it? That's just the worst case scenario. I work my bike shop. I go visit them. I say, man, I can't worry about you guys with COVID. And it's like, what do you mean? This is the best sales month we've ever had. We have no bikes to sell. And we won't have any bikes for a year. Like, okay, that's not what I was expecting. I was thinking they're going to be sitting there, all out of a job. And in fact, they started closing more days because they had no bikes to sell. That's pretty amazing. But that's an outbound logistics problem. You can't get the product to sell it, your revenues are going to suffer. Marketing sales, how strong are you on that? How good is your marketing? Nike, obviously, Adidas or Adidas. Marketing is a big part of this. And then service, how strong are you on that piece? And is your firm strong in all of these, or is there one of these? And I think that's really where you add value in paper too. Is there one of these areas where they're particularly strong? They really, really excel in that particular area. Anything you do in your value chain is going to impact your revenue, is going to impact your expenses. So it impacts turnover and it affects margins. You can't be so good at it, it costs you a fortune, and then your margins are destroyed. So it's a balance. Obviously you'd be really good at service if you hire 5,000 new service providers, but that's going to cost you a fortune. Do you really need that? So think about this with your firm, but also with your industry. So when we talk about the differentiation, this is part of the differentiation. How does your firm separate itself from the competitors? And how does a typical firm in your industry? Is your industry really focused on one of these things over the others? Then you have the support. I don't know how many firms excel on the support side, but I guess it's possible. The Cinnabon business breakdown, which is one of my favorites. So you mentioned one of their huge advantages was the team they had doing the joint ventures and they had the side deal with Burger King and some other things. And she just said, because of their connection with a much bigger firm, I forget what their major holder was, but they own the Anti whatever? What? I think, yeah. So I don't know who owns that whole group, but she's saying the advantage they had is their corporate office. The people in that office knew this business better than anybody else. So she was saying that was a huge advantage for them when it comes to those type of joint ventures. Whether that's true or not. Human resources. I read a book by Goldman Sachs, HR person, and now Goldman Sachs is obviously struggling. No, it's Google. Excuse me, it's Google. It was Google's HR. And it's an interesting book. I don't buy a lot of books on human resources, but interesting book. Why does Google spend so much time and money on each new hire? It's an incredibly expensive process, very lengthy process. Their argument is there's nothing worse for a company than to hire a bad employee. They're hard to get rid of. Everybody's got to work around them. So they spend a lot of time making sure they have the right person. They view their human resources as a huge advantage for them. You could debate that. Technology, obviously, procurement, to me, procurement's a big part of it, the inbound logics, but procurement is managing inventory, managing suppliers. How good is your procurement department? The strength of this is, like with a lot of porters, is getting into the details, really understanding it. So this value chain is going to add costs, but it's also going to add differentiation. And then I like what Porter says about differentiation. What is differentiation? You might think about this on paper too. I'm getting a little bit ahead. The way you differentiate yourself is you reduce your buyer costs. You do a favor for your buyer. You find something they're doing that if they come to you, it's going to reduce their costs. And that can be cost of dollars or time. Or you improve the buyer's performance or satisfaction. So how do you, in this process, differentiate yourself so that you do something for your buyer that they appreciate, they value, that the competition is not doing as well? Now, the HelloFresh, they talked about their competitor. I can't remember the name of their competitor. And I think the guy he was interviewing was a little leery because I think it was a HelloFresh CEO type person. I can't remember, but they were a little leery about bad-mouthing their competition. But the question was, why has HelloFresh done well? Your competition didn't. And if you can understand that, you can do a really good analysis of your company, because the next question you ask is that something HelloFresh can keep distinctive, or could someone else come in and copy them? So get this in your notes. It's not just how they do this, but why aren't their competition doing it? What is it distinct about them? And if it can't be competed, what's the key word in here? What do you think the most important word there is? Sustainable. If you're really great at something, what does everybody else do? they copy you. Sustainable means they can't copy you for some reason. Why is it so hard for competitors to compete against NVIDIA? Their knowledge base is so deep. Their workers like staying there. How are you going to compete with them? They have that just decade-long knowledge in a very specialized area. Gives them a huge, huge advantage. So it's a competitive advantage, but it's got to be, if it's not sustainable, you don't have it. And where does that come from? And Porter really says it comes from your value chain management. It's how you manage that whole process from start to finish. He doesn't say you have to be strong in all of them. You need to be in the pack on most of them, and then one of them is probably where you need to really distinguish yourself. So I doubt many of them are like HelloFresh, and we're just going to kill on all of them. But it's not a bad approach. He talks about the cost drivers. Not all of these make sense to me listening to his book, but there are some overlaps with this value chain and the Porter's analysis. So economies of scale is important. Learning and spillovers, those things. So that's what Cinnabon was talking about, spillovers. What do we learn here that we can also apply over here that our competition doesn't have? That's that spillover effect. Capacity utilization, that you're really good at using the resources that you have. Linkages between your value chain components that make them work more efficiently. An interrelationship between departments. Vertical integration, that you're buying a competitor or buying a supplier. Timing, and there's two timings. There's first mover advantage. That's kind of the Facebook advantage. You're the first one, and so there's no reason you don't need anyone else. That's the Uber advantage. You know, you're the first one, so everybody goes to you because everybody goes to you. And there's the last mover advantage. You sit there and watch the competition waste a lot of money figuring it all out, and you just copy them. Which is the better approach? It depends on what market you're in. In platform businesses, you better be the first mover. But in other businesses, you can just step back and wait. That may be what's going on in EVs. Toyota has gotten beat up. I actually like the plug-in hybrid. I think it's better than the EV, but Toyota now is making a major move on batteries. Maybe they decided they really weren't behind. Maybe they decided, hey, we're just going to wait, see what everybody else is doing, and then we're just going to jump in on the best technology. Who knows? Your policies, your location, other things, institutional factors. You look at the Carnival Cruise Line or some of the cruise lines, since they pay no taxes, that's a huge advantage. If you don't pay any tax, that increases your net income, 30, 40%. So these are the kind of things he talks about. In his book, he goes example after example of each one of these. So that's why the book just goes on forever. I think it'd be really helpful if he had his book specific to your industry, your company, but I don't know if you could actually find that in his book. He probably has a pretty good appendix, but it's amazing about this. This is he right here. Or I guess that's kind of, I don't know how much he looks like his caricature. All right, so that's value chain. Have any of y'all tried Googling value chain in your company name? Just try it and see what comes up. I'll try it too here. Almost always something will come up. You can just do value chain analysis. Here's one, Walmart's value chain analysis. There it is right there, inbound logistics, outbound operations, marketing, sales. Walmart, are y'all finding the same thing? You'll probably find dozens of them. More for paper two, but still, one advantage of starting now is it could definitely give you some ideas for paper one. So UPS, who's doing UPS? Forgot. Oh, you are, okay. So is there a value chain difference between UPS and FedEx? And can you tell, there's one stronger versus the other? That, since you're such a concentrated industry, that would certainly help if you're trying to do that, the major players and how they're distinctive. You might do a quick look through the value chain of each of them and just see, hey, there's something really distinctive about these two companies. We'll talk about that more when we talk about the generic strategies, but I doubt any of your companies, because you all are all doing fairly large companies, I doubt any of them, just nothing will come up on value chain. You might look at, I haven't thought to do this, you might look at Natasha's site and see if she has a value chain link. So go back to her site and just see if she has it. If not, you might email her. She's a really good research. And make sure you do what when you email her. I remember, huge appreciation. We really appreciate what you're doing for our students. All right. Questions on that value chain analysis? If you've never heard it, get it into your nomenclature as an undergraduate student. I'm not sure how many finance programs undergraduate cover value chain. I think it's pretty rare. I'm sorry, I thought you were asking. So yes, it's Porter. He's a pretty amazing guy. My life insurance class, we're going to talk about his healthcare reform analysis. So he's in the middle of that as well. So the guy's like, there must be like 6 of them. They're all cloned walking around doing stuff because it's pretty amazing what he's doing. All right, let's talk about his 5 forces, which is his most famous thing. So real key, always think about your goal. So think of it in terms of growth. Is this an industry that's going to grow faster than average, grow average, or below average? That's what you're ultimately after. He calls it industry's attractiveness and profitability, but attractiveness and profitability are just another way of saying growth. So his 5 forces: threat of new entrants. An industry is unattractive if new competitors can easily enter when the industry is profitable, thus increasing competition and reducing margins. So those doing Chipotle, that's a huge weakness for your industry. It's really easy to start a new restaurant. We'll talk about brand name here pretty soon. The branding itself is becoming less powerful as a protection. The world is changing somewhat. A UPS and FedEx, threat of new entrants is probably, here's something when you're doing threat of new entrants, you can talk about UPS and FedEx, but you might bring up Amazon Prime and them doing delivery and what that means. The UPS business breakdowns, they do a good job of discussing that. So you could bring that up. Is that really a threat? I'm amazed. Y'all kind of take it for granted, but I'm amazed Tesla exists. And I'm also amazed the Chinese auto manufacturers. For the longest time, you can't do auto manufacturing because the barriers to entry are too much. The capital requirements, the branding, all that's too important. And then Tesla somehow did it. It's pretty amazing that he did that. And not only did he do it, but that he essentially cornered the market on EVs. But then these Chinese auto manufacturers, I was reading an Economist article, their cars aren't doing real great here, but have y'all bought a car from a Chinese company? So they're doing EVs, but they're not working too well here. But it's still amazing that they're doing extremely well, and just the number of the cars that they're selling is pretty amazing. So threat of new entrants, that's an easy one to talk about, but you do want to think about, and that's where Porter. Boy, I hate that part of Zoom. Oh. Better new entrants, you notice there's several things listed in there. I bet you could find at least 2, maybe 3 that apply to your industry. So read through them. Experience needed, but training easily available. Some economies of scale, some cost benefits of the business, if in the business for some time. No technology protection, low barriers to entry, new entry quite easy. So he has a list, but there's other lists out there. I think MarketLine has a huge list, doesn't it? Y'all know what I'm talking about? That's wheel they do. Don't do I forget who I was talking to with MarketLine, someone this week. But it looked like, yeah, probably Mohammed. Yeah, it looked like 2 or 3 were on the exact same thing. It was like, what's the difference between that and that? So you don't feel like you got to talk all of them, but let that list help you kind of generate. I think that's the real key to me for porters is it's a template to help you think of things you might not have thought of without it. So use the details and then kick out the stuff that doesn't apply. But yeah, and if you Google Porter's 5 forces, there's there's all kinds of he's so popular. There's all kinds of websites. I think Wikipedia does a pretty good job with it. So threat of new entrants, all of you will talk about that one. That one's just a standard that everybody does. Robbery within the industry. All right, so I was talking to someone else on threat to new entrants. I think it might have been Selma. Yeah, I think it was. So Selma has an industry which is essentially 4 players. I think you said essentially. So you've got CSX, your company, Burlington, and then a Canadian company. Was there another one?
Which is Berkshire Hathaway, Canadian Pacific, and Canadian Northern.
So essentially 4. And then our concern was she won't be able to get any information on Burlington because it's owned by Berkshire. And then we opened Berkshire's annual report and there's a whole page on Burlington. Revenues, fuel costs, it's like, okay, that's perfect. So one thing that she probably could do once we get Capital IQ up and running is she could probably bring in the CapEx of those 4 companies and look at it as percentage of revenue or CFO to get a sense how big is the CapEx in this industry? How expensive is it? And probably do it over time because any given year might be, especially 2020 could be a little unusual. So that's part of a threat of new entrants is how much CapEx does this industry spend? How expensive is it? There are some industries that spend 100% of their earnings on CapEx. Everything's reinvested. That's one reason we hate airlines so much. They got to buy new planes all the time because the new planes are more capital, they're more energy efficient, all those kind of things. But it's like they're chasing themselves. They produce $1 billion in cash and they got to put $1 billion back into the business. It's just a really tough industry. But that makes it hard for new players to come in. None of you are doing airlines, but I was doing an airline. One thing I'd want to research is Ryanair. How did Ryanair get this to work? What exactly did they do? I think there may be a business breakdown on Ryanair. Really interesting. You see a new airline come in and not just survive, but actually thrive and kick the others out. That's pretty interesting. What is he doing that's different? So threat of new entrants. Robbery within the industry. So here's where that table can be so good. How you distinguish in is we'll talk about this more when we talk about differentiation. But this is a good place for that value chain analysis to be. Where do these firms focus in on the value chain? Are they all strong in the same areas or they have differences between them? So an industry is unattractive where there's intense rivalry, and the worst thing you want is an industry where the market's shrinking. There's a few big players and they're fighting over market share, and the only way you fight over market share is you cut prices, margins shrink. That's just the worst industry. Essentially what they're trying to do is put each other out of business, and it's whoever can survive. That's a horrible industry. One thing you can do here, that's if you can find the numbers. So if you have an industry that's pretty strength, so UPS and FedEx is probably not a bad one to do this with, but get their revenues, say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and today, and kind of think pie chart. Were they 50-50 5 years ago and they're still 50-50? A good example is my industry, property and casualty insurance. You look at the growth of Geico and Progressive in that industry and how State Farm is shrinking. It's pretty amazing how those new players, those 2 companies came in and really took over the industry really pretty quickly on auto insurance. But I could look at Geico and Progressive's market share 10 years ago versus today, and you'd see them going from like 3% to 15 or 20%. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So something like that can help you with the rivalry within the industry. You could do it with restaurants. I think someone was showing restaurants, McDonald's versus Subway. Is it changing? Is the industry pretty static, or is it changing over time, or are there new players coming in? That may be related to threat of new entrants as well. Y'all stop me if you have a question on these. Everybody's going to do these first 2. That's going to apply to all of you. Now, someone was noticing, it might have been Jose, that market line's not written all that well, or you were telling me that. Yeah, it's pretty sloppy writing, but you're not using it as your first draft. You're using it just to give you ideas. So you're just look into it and see what they have to say. All right, supplier power and buyer power. Don't get mixed up on these. I have students that confuse them. Okay. Some students think buyer power. What's the buying power of my industry? That's not it. It's the buying power of your customers. right? Supplier power is the power of the people supplying you stuff. So supplier power, this is where you can put some macro factors in there. So like Selma was going to look, fuel cost is a big part of our industry. Genesis fuel cost is a big part of your industry. So yours is probably diesel fuel, I would guess. I don't know, they may be gasoline. That's a pretty obvious macro factor to do. So what do you want to do? So on the macro factor, we'll talk more about macro factors a little bit, just so you start thinking about this. So there's a few things you want to make really, really, really clear. Okay. So you want to talk about its history. That's usually a chart, the history of this factor. So if you're doing diesel fuel, just look at over time. It's probably going to be pretty volatile. So how do you get this data? So let's do used car prices. So I just type what I'm looking for, and then I usually type the word Fred. Why do I type the word Fred? Fred is who? Federal Reserve. And they have such a great, great website. Can you see 2020 and COVID in there? Pretty amazing, right? Now, I guess, Jojo, with you, this one could be pretty interesting, right? Um, so, there it is right there, and you can dump it to Excel. We used to have that Fred add-in that you could add it into your Excel, but I always hated it because I could never find anything. I think this is easier because you can dump that right into Excel. I think what they've done is made it much easier. So there you have used car prices back to 1955. Pretty amazing. I don't know if they have diesel fuel prices. We can try it. I don't know how to spell diesel. D-I-E. D-E. What? D S-E-L. I can't type. I can't spell and I can't type. Yeah, that looks about right. Definitely 2020 brought them down, shot up. This here, if y'all do the Baltic Dry Index, you'll always see this big jump here, which is mainly China. China would just cause prices to go up everywhere. But there you have it right there, all the way back to doesn't go back that far, but it goes back to 1995. So you want to look at the history. So Fred is your friend. You want to say where it is today. So you kind of ask, are we in an unusual period now, or is this a normal period of time? Are we on some long trend? What's going on here? That's where things like China have impacts. China has definitely slowed down this year. That could be beneficial to some of these companies, that it may help reduce some of the costs. Expectations. This is where, if you can, you want some quotes from experts. What do people expect going forward? What's going to be the impact? And then this is the hardest part, but this is really you gotta put it in, is importance to the industry. So let's say someone does fuel. Do we figure out the fuel is? Is it coal or? I mean, they transport coal a lot, so I don't know if it's coal or diesel. I don't know how a train. You may know how a train operates today. I'm probably thinking 1800s. So the importance of the industry. So let's say Selma brings that in, fuel costs, and fuel costs are 0.3% of their cost of goods sold. Probably not an important one. I think we saw with the Berkshire Hathaway, it was a pretty big number. It was like 20-30% of the revenues. So if you can bring that data in, here's where Capital IQ can really, really help you. Capital IQ tends to have that detail. And so what you can do is You bring capital IQ in, you can actually just type the word fuel, and capital IQ will bring everything up that's related to fuel, and then you can bring it in and maybe take fuel costs as a percentage of cost of goods sold or a percentage of revenue. And so if you don't have the importance of the industry, you just have this gee whiz number. Oh, wow, diesel fuels were high. Well, is that a major part of their business? So for UPS, I would imagine fuel cost is a big part of their business. I know with airlines, obviously jet fuel cost is a major part of their cost of goods sold, as it drives ticket prices pretty dramatically in that industry. So that's what you're looking for. I just saw Julia. I can't think for your company, but think through it. What that is. You can. One thing I would say is skilled labor is not a bad macro factor for this paper. And it can be, you can get some pretty good data on immigration. So what is a macro factor? It can be an economic number. It can be demographics related, those type of things. You need numbers. So macro, you need numbers. It can't just be subjective discussion. So there are charts out there on the shortage of skilled labor. There are charts on there. So I don't know about, I can't remember if you're doing Dolby or Adobe. You're doing Dolby. Yeah, so they're probably high skilled labor. They're probably having trouble finding new workers. And then you can bring in the new requirements for our government for skilled labor. That's what Congress seems to think, we don't want immigrants, but we want skilled immigrants. Okay, great. The whole world wants skilled immigrants, obviously. And we actually need unskilled immigrants too, but we just don't realize it. So, you can bring in the subjective, what's going on with Congress and those type of things. But as long as you can show a history, talk about where we are today and what the expectations are, that all works as long as it's important to the industry. So if it's not important in the industry, you might start with that. And if it is, then go find the data. Now, I don't think you're gonna find much on skilled labor on Fred, but you just do skilled labor shortages. We can try Fred, but I don't think it's gonna be in there. Unfilled job vacancies, that's kind of a high. Yeah, the Fred stuff is a little too generic. There's Mike Rowe. He's talking about not skilled labor, but horrible jobs, I guess. So you'll be able to find articles because it's a big deal. Firms are having a tough time finding workers in a lot of fields. Trucking is as well, right? Trucking is having a tough time finding drivers. So, all right, we'll talk more about macro, but you can definitely get a lot of these macro factors on the supplier power. That's really where it fits in. Labor-related issues, input prices, those kind of things are supplier. Some of your companies don't actually build anything, so labor is going to have to be your main focus because you don't have a raw material to bring in. So supplier power and industry is unattractive if the suppliers have the power. It could be one major supplier that just dominates everything. But the key to supplier power is it's got to be an important input. So you might say, hey, I have one supplier, but it's only 1% of your cost of goods sold. That's not that big of a deal. It's not going to have that much of an impact on you. None of you are doing EVs. What's the big issue on EVs? It's those precious earth kind of things. What is lithium? I can't remember my whatever those inputs are. Copper's a big deal right now because copper comes from some pretty unstable countries. That would be a supplier power issue. Any of y'all have issues on supplier power? You're not sure about your companies? Supplier power should be a big part of your paper. And it should probably have at least one, if not two, macro factors in it. Everybody's good on that? I can't tell. This class always is like, everybody just looks shell-shocked. I never really tell. Yeah, supplier gives something to, so it's back to that value chain. It's someone outside of the firm that's at the first part of that value chain. So if you're producing a good, it's pretty obvious. So if you're doing Nike, it's going to be cotton, something like that. If you're doing Nike, you're probably going to have to talk about sweatshops and overseas textiles. That's the supplier power. If you're doing transportation, it's probably going to be fuel costs.
If you have an assortment, would you include like maybe like the major three? Or,
What company are you doing?
or.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if you can find stuff. That's the question, is how much detail they give you on their cost of goods sold. That's where you start with the cost of goods sold and try to figure out what's in there. You could go to their annual report and maybe have something in there. You can see what Capital IQ has, but you have to have a word to search on. So I don't know what word, I don't know what tile's made out of, but you probably could just type cost of goods sold and maybe they'll have some detailed lines there, but you're kind of stuck with whatever the firm reports. The annual report's probably the best place to start and just see what details they're providing there. What are tiles made out of? Is it bamboo? Is it plastic? You know, I don't know. It's pretty amazing. The fake wood. The fake wood is not wood, but boy, it sure looks like wood. Yeah, I mean, it lasts a lot longer, but I don't know what that is. That sounds more like a petroleum product, maybe. So yeah, but yeah, do your best. That's why I say visiting the store and talking to the manager and see what they would divulge. That might be interesting. It's probably out there somewhere. So, and then the business breakdown might talk some about that. One thing I like about business breakdown is they essentially give you that income statement. Here's the revenues, here's the cost of goods sold, here's how much it costs to get a customer, here's the marketing. You know, they do a pretty good job of that. And they'll often go into the details of the cost of goods sold. So, but yeah, you're stuck with whatever data you have. Or other questions in supplier power, make sure it's a big part of your paper. At least labor is going to be, everybody's going to have labor. It's just a big part of any business, especially if you're skilled labor, that's going to be a big part of your discussion. All right, buyer power. Here, you got to think about it in a couple ways. If you're doing, let's think of Visa. So I forgot who's doing Visa. I talked to them this week. All right, so Wang and I talked about this on Visa. Visa's buyers is really Bank of America, JP Morgan, but ultimately Visa's buyers is the retail consumer. So you can talk about both of those. So how does this industry deal with those businesses? It's really a business to business. You don't get your Visa card from Visa, you get it from your bank. So that's that part of it. But then you need to talk about the US consumer. So some things I'll talk about with Wang is, you know, a credit card, consumer credit, that's a really easy one to get. Consumer credit spread. It comes right up. And there it is, consumer credit. Now it's a bad chart. It should be log normal. So, you know, convert. If you see a chart like that, you'll know log normal, right? Y'all know there's log normal in this. Y'all done that in your other classes. What does log normal do for you? Y'all know this. Y'all had stats, right? So the problem here is the compounding over time, right? The nice thing about a log normal chart is a 10% change looks the same all along the chart. So that helps you. Here, you can't see a 10% change here because the compounding. But if you do log normal, a 10% in 1950 will look the same as a 10% change there. So if you see a chart like that, try log normal. And it's pretty easy to do. You just dump the data in Excel and do the graph and just click the log normal. Well, unless you have a Mac, I have no clue on the Mac. So good luck with the Mac. But now one thing I have done on this chart before, now the problem with this credit, fortunately, it doesn't include mortgages. So that's nice because mortgages are really distorted, but it does include auto loans. So it's credit cards and auto loans. So he's got a little noise. Could he find just credit card debt? Probably so. I don't know if he could find it in Fred, but probably so. But this is debt outside of mortgages. One thing I've done with this is I take this chart and I take personal income and I like to graph them together to see how much more credit is growing than incomes. Obviously, credit is growing faster because people are starting to use credit cards as a transaction card. So instead of using cash and using checks, so part of it's artificial, but that's been going on for 10, 20 years. So what is credit doing? You see the 2020 drop, but then you see the this, whatever the stimulus package going in there. That's a pretty hefty growth rate up there. So that would be important to him. Credit card, people are gonna use their credit cards, but if they get tapped out, they have too much credit, they're gonna have to cut back. So, we're at an unusual period. So there's a lot he could do with that one chart. So consumer credit would work really well under buyer power. If he could somehow equate consumer credit to personal income, that would be good. We can try, Hoang, we can just see credit card debt. No, it's credit cards and other revolving that you don't, those, well, credit card probably dominates that, so that might be a card. Credit cards, I don't know what that is. Number of credit cards. I'll look at that. There's some pretty good stuff there. So wow, look at yeah, you got, man, you have a whole, how many things is that? There you go. So he has 50 things he can do under buyer power. So buyer power, you all have buyer power. It might be your direct buyer, but then think about the ultimate consumer as well. So if you're doing medical equipment or pharmacies, who's doing the pharmacy? Is that okay, Luis? Yeah, we're talking about that. So a pharmacy is probably selling to hospitals and doctors, but ultimately there's some consumers. So is the ultimate consumer, is it a senior citizen? Is it someone younger? Is it heart disease? Is it cancer? What exactly are they selling? What's the big drug today? It's the weight loss drug, right? So who's that going to be sold to? Who's going to use that drug? How effective is it? The wonderful thing about, I don't know if your company does that drug. Do you know? Yeah, so the wonderful thing about that drug is if you stop using it, it wears off. There's nothing better for a pharmaceutical than an expensive drug that you have to use for the rest of your life, right? That's a wonderful drug. Maybe not for the user. And the side effects on that drug just sound horrible to me. So I don't know if I'd ever want to use it, but.
I have a quick question for buying. So this is pharmaceutical. Would the buying power be what insurance consumer has? And let's just say, oh, the insurance is not still to purchase the product liability, but they can go some other company that they're doing.
Well, talking about generics and all those kind of things, you can get that more in your paper too. Here, the thing is, who's the ultimate consumer? So here's how demographics can really, you probably were going to put most of y'all some kind of demographics in the buyer. So if your ultimate consumer is, say, heart disease, that's senior citizens. You could certainly do some demographics on the aging of America, how many, because you have the baby boomers and you have the echo boomers and you have that lull in between. Demographics we're terrible at forecasting, but demographics is the one thing we're really good at forecasting. We have a pretty good idea how many 70-year-olds are going to be in 20 years from now. I mean, it's plus or minus with COVID, but a lot better than where the stock market's going to be in 20 years. So that kind of data works pretty well. And that's one where your forecast, you can actually get the forecast because, you can send that out. So you're trying to figure out who's their main customer ultimately. Now, if you want to talk about this new bill, the Medicare, you're going to have to talk about that, right? And here's this new Medicare bill. There's a great article today on the 10 drugs. I don't know if you've seen that, the 10 drugs that they're going to negotiate. So you can see if your firm has those drugs. Your industry that you're doing is fighting that pretty hard, right? They're even suing to try to stop it. So you can talk about that. That doesn't lend itself to a macro because you can't really put it in the chart, but you could definitely talk about that under buyer power. So for his industry, Medicare is a huge buyer for him. So you're going to spend a lot of time in insurance companies as well. So you got Medicare, you have insurance companies. Insurance companies is mainly through employers. So you have that issue. So there's a lot of things on the buyer power you can definitely talk about. Not all of those will lend themselves to be a macro issue. So you do have the subjective discussion. So he'll probably have a paragraph or two on Medicare and the new law and how that's going to affect them. So buyer power is important to all of yours. Ultimately, for any buyer is going to be the U.S. consumer, even business to business. So if you're doing business to business, maybe your number one consumer is the airlines industry. So maybe you're Boeing. None of you are doing Boeing. But if Americans and people around the world aren't flying, that's going to hurt airlines. It's going to hurt you as Boeing. So ultimately, you got to talk. So you could, under buyer power, talk about how many people, how often people are flying, those kind of things. Now, I guess with your, your buyer is insurance companies, it sounds like. So, you could look at accident rates and those kind of things. One chart I like that's really easy to do is vehicle miles driven. Really interesting statistic. Obviously 2020, you're going to see a big, now you see how that, you get that kind of seasonality. How do you fix that? Edit the chart and just go to annual. And that fixes that, right? When you see something that's real, obviously people drive a whole lot more in the summer. So you get that. So you don't need that. But here you see the 2020 impact. And the first, well, in 2008, we actually cut back. I think this is the first time in history vehicle miles driven globally went down. This is just the US. So even because China's shooting up, right? So that's a really interesting statistic, because what does Copart want? They want people driving all the time because that's what they're replacing. So that's a really good statistic. So there's wonderful statistics out there. You just got to know that they exist. And that's why reading their annual report and looking at, there's ways that just give you an idea. It's like, wow, that's really, really interesting. I know with UPS and FedEx are really popular statistics. I don't know if you can find it or not. Let's see. Have you heard of the cardboard box index? Does that sound familiar? You can spell it. So, but it's in Investopedia. So the transportation industry has been somewhat of a leading indicator. And one thing we know is UPS and FedEx, you see a large increase in cardboard box purchases in building. Why? Because they know a lot of orders are coming. So they're kind of this leading indicator. I was listening to an economic presentation actually on September 10th, 2001. Interesting presentation right before 9/11, the day before. But this economist, he said this is one of the most important indices he looks at. He wasn't for your industry, he's looking at for the overall economy. But he said this is an incredibly accurate leading indicator when cardboard boxes are getting built. For somehow these transportation companies know orders are coming and they put that in there. The ISM, don't forget about the ISM. And one thing to remember on these indices, like the ISM is the headline number, but there's a lot of detail underneath it. And you can get charts on those as well. So the ISM has new orders. That's probably the most important thing from your standpoint, maybe even from railroads as well. New orders. Why? Because that's telling you things are picking up. New orders, that's what you got to fill in the future. So there's manufacturers' new orders, durable goods, new orders, total manufacturing. So don't just think ISM and then look at the details and see what those components are. Same thing with CPI. When you do Fred for CPI, they have CPI, but they also have, the last time I looked, it was like 40, 50,000. I mean, if you want to know the CPI for copper or for whatever, they have all of this stuff. But the hard thing is finding it. You got to type exactly the right terms. So it's just all kinds of stuff. They have 51 under housing. Rent. I don't know if any of y'all are affected by rent. They have 74 for food and beverage. What's the CPI for food away from home? So Chipotle, I mean, that might work for y'all doing Chipotle. Who's doing Chipotle? A few of y'all. Yeah, so Dante, there's one. What's the CPI for food away from home? Transportation, no telling what's in there. We just saw the used car one. Gasoline, airline fares, so most of this is probably in Statista as well. I like Fred better because it's a lot easier to dump into Excel, I think, but it's going to be in either place. So yeah, when you type CPI, you're not typing CPI, you're getting all of their data, and there's just thousands and thousands. They track a lot of things in there. And like Luis, they got medical care. There's probably some pharmaceuticals in there. So and they have statistics specific on specific types of workers as well. So there's a lot of data in there. So some of that's supplier, obviously, some of it's buyer power. Buyer power is, so let's say you're doing Chipotle, maybe you compare the inflation of groceries versus the inflation for restaurants and just see, are they moving together or are they out of whack in some way? And that would be a buyer power, because obviously, you know, we were talking somewhere that someone was talking from this class that, you know, McDonald's is about the cheapest calorie you can find anywhere, a really, really cheap way to get calories. It'd be almost, you'd have a tough time going to HEB and finding calories that cheap. I mean, it's just a really cheap way to get a lot of calories real fast. But McDonald's has done a good job somehow keeping their margins stable, even with food prices rising. I don't think that's not even a bad one to do as well. You got the input price on food, and then you have the restaurant prices. Are those two getting squeezed? And you get a sense that is going on. And then you throw on top of that DoorDash, which is another cost they have to handle. Are restaurants getting squeezed? So, you know, those kind of things you can bring under supplier power and buyer power. Just make sure you're in the right place. These two might be, you know, 50% of your orders, because they're just really critical factors for most people. So questions on buyer power? You see how the Fred can really be your friend here, Dante?
Just compared to like I think with the buyer power,
Yeah, for you, you really are selling directly to the retail consumer. Yeah. On supplier power, you know, if you can find one particular food item, maybe it's beef or something, that's a particularly major part. And it's back to the question we're asking earlier, if, you know, with Juan Carlos, if you can really say, hey, beef is 15% of their cost of goods sold, and here's what the costs have done, that's more powerful than saying, we know beef is in there, we don't know how material it is. One thing we'll talk about on paper 3 that's real frustrating to me, and I don't know if y'all have accounting classes left. Are y'all done with accounting? So a question you should ask in your accounting class, but I never get students early enough, is the accounting rules for cost of goods sold. So if you look at Chipotle as a cost of goods sold, what is in that number? So definitely the food's in there. The plastics are probably in there, but how much of their labor costs are in their cost of goods sold? And I don't know if you can figure that out when you look at their numbers. And if labor is in that cost, which labor is in there? I mean, that's a good example for Dolby, right? What's in Dolby's cost of goods sold? They probably have cost of goods sold, don't they? And exactly what is it? Is it DBL? Nope. What is it, DLB? I'm shocked sometimes when I look at a firm and look at their cost of goods sold, theirs is really small. That you know, it probably used to be a much bigger number. Technology is probably down. Looks like it's come down quite a bit just in the last few years, but it's still $143 million. What is Dolby's $143 million? You would think it's actual physical stuff, right? That they do some manufacturing, I would assume, would be in there. You look at a Chipotle, I can never remember, Chipotle, CMG. It's massive. That can't just be food. That can't just be plastic. There's got to be a lot of employees in that number. And then where does DoorDash go in that number? Understanding that's actually really critically important as a finance person, because you're not going to understand the business if you don't understand the number. The other question I have is, how different is Chipotle from Sonic or Jack in the Box? And you said Chipotle doesn't franchise. McDonald's does, or not, maybe we're talking about Starbucks. Does Chipotle franchise? So that's a big difference too, right? If you're doing a restaurant, McDonald's is overwhelmingly franchised. That's a radically different business than one that owns their stores. So that's going to change your cost of goods sold pretty dramatically. You have the cost of goods sold of a McDonald's franchise. That's has nothing to do with the cost of goods sold of McDonald's. So understanding that's really, really critical, especially if you're in an interview and this comes up. If you don't understand that, they're gonna look at you kind of funny. So spend a lot of time here on supplier power and buyer power. The value chain management might actually help you with that, just understanding their whole process, where all those costs. You're always thinking costs. It's like, wow, they're really good at service, but how much is it costing them to provide that high quality service? Get your outline first, what you're going to talk about. Call me. I don't know these industries as well as I know insurance and banking, but call me and we can certainly brainstorm together and some ideas on this. No questions on buyer, supplier, big part of your paper. Now, if the supplier has a lot of power, how do you put that into your summary? Supplier power is negative for industry, all right? Don't use strong and weak. It's so confusing to me to use strong and weak. Someone else was saying, just reading market line, it's just like, well, I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Buyer power is strong, well, that's bad. But entry barriers, that's strong, well, that's good. Okay, it's really confusing. So positive for industry, negative for industry, all right? Be much clearer. Yeah, I hate these things. If y'all put it in your paper, I'm not even gonna look at it. First of all, if you copy from market line, it's completely useless because it's not even yours. But yeah, this is the global insurance, and I look at that and just think, what exactly are they saying? I don't even know why substitutes even in there. Substitutes for a lot of you is going to be 0. Oh, I left out one. I left out substitution. There we go. Threat of substitution. Okay, I don't know why this other stuff's in there. All right, here's an example of a summary chart that you could do. I think I just somehow got my charts. Let me do threat of substitutes first. I think the chart just got out of order. Whoa. Boy, I'm not good at that. All right, threat of substitutes. Threat of substitutes is one that many of you might not do at all. So if it doesn't apply to your industry, just put it in there and say, I do not believe this applies to my industry. All right. Now you could get creative on this. I haven't drunk milk in years. I only do soy. That's a substitution threat. It's not a substitution threat if I switch from 2% to whole milk. That's because milk is produced by the milk industry, just because they use a different milk product. So we're talking about an entirely different industry. All right. So substitution threat is something coming out of left field. So if I'm doing Valero, my substitution threat is electricity. It's EVs, pretty straightforward, pretty obvious. All right. I don't know with UPS, maybe it's drones. Are they doing any drones? Maybe they're in that business. I don't know. And usually a substitution threat is you're talking something new. That's why I put this book down here. I really recommend reading this book. It's so old, but it's a really good book. Clayton Christensen, unfortunately, he passed away a couple years ago, but has written some really, really good books, and that's one of them. It's a really excellent book. What I like about the book, he's talking about some disruptive innovation. And that's what threat of substitution is. Some new industry comes in and does what your industry is doing and knocks you out. So a good example is Western Union. Western Union was in the telegraph business. Supposedly Alexander Bell came to them and says, hey, I have this new invention to sell to you. And they say, we're not interested. That was a substitution threat. In this book, he says, was Western Union's decision not to do the telephone a stupid decision? And if you actually read what he says, no. Given what they had so much capital invested in telegraph. That was their customer base. They had contracts. If they did the telephone, it was going to be a distraction. It was going to be a competitor against themselves. And they also said, no one's going to want to sit and talk on a telephone. That's kind of a waste. So they miss out. Yeah, but they're still in business today. So that's pretty amazing, isn't it? But that was a substitution threat. They didn't see it coming in. One thing he'll talk about is it's pretty common for an industry to miss an obvious substitution because they have so much capital invested in the current state. And, you know, if they're doing $1 billion in the current state, that thought of getting into this whole new business, that's also billions of dollars, they can't handle it. The other thing he talks about is most businesses reward the current state. That's the way the employees are rewarded. If you throw in this new technology, the reward system is just not set up to do that. The employees have no incentive to bring this new technology in. So it's really tough to avoid this if you're in that type of business. So when I was a kid, boy, commercial after commercial for your long distance carrier. When's the last time you saw a long distance carrier commercial? Y'all don't even know what that is, do you? Do you know that your parents had to choose a long distance carrier? Have any of y'all picked your long distance carrier? Y'all even know what a long distance call is? Right? Did you get to do that?
Yeah,
I never really had to get into it much. I don't think I never make long distance calls, but now you just pick up your, huh?
He was the strongest.
Oh, I can't remember the MCI or I can't even remember who they are now. But that whole industry got disrupted by Apple and the smartphone and just so there are those. So the key with substitution threat is for most of your industries, it may be NA, but if it's applicable, it's really huge because it can take the entire industry out. So we're not really talking about rail versus ground versus air versus shipping. Those have always been around. They've always been competing. We're really talking about something new coming in, a whole new industry and just completely disrupting your industry. We'll talk more about disruptive innovation more. It's really, really important. Christian does a good job of saying, what is it? How do you see it coming? How do you recognize it? How do disruptors mess up by moving too fast? One thing you don't want to be is a disruptor and Walmart notices you because they're just going to take you out. They're so big. But how did Family Dollar and those stores come in around Walmart? How did Walmart let them? You would think Family Dollar would be a big threat to Walmart and they would just take them out, but somehow they did it. How they did? They're pretty successful, right? Because if Family Dollar, I can forget the other ones are. Dollar General, I guess is the one I see everywhere. Dollar General. Walmart's tried to do a smaller footprint, but they just can't get it to work. But why did Walmart let Dollar General come in and take this business? Very disruptive. So I don't know if any of y'all think you have a threat of substitute. You should at least look at Market Line to see what they're saying. For UPS. But yeah, so I was saying, you're not doing UPS, are you? You're doing, oh, you both are. Okay. So it's hard to say. There is a growing use of drones. But I would guess UPS and FedEx could do the drones. They could invest in that. So it's not quite a threat. I mean, to get crazy ideas is they were talking about that cone you put under the earth and it just swings you, you know, speed of sound. I forget what it's called. I mean, stuff like that is possible. Autonomous vehicles could be it, but my guess is FedEx and UPS are going to use autonomous vehicles. They're probably already investing in that. So it's hard for me to think of that. Now, Amazon Prime coming in and delivering that's not a substitution threat. That's a new competitor coming in. That's completely different. That's rivalry or entry barriers. That's a different thing. Yeah, like the little robots. Yeah, but that kind of me is at the very end. FedEx and UPS are getting it to that point. You're not going to do a robot from El Paso to San Antonio. So when you get it to San Antonio, then it might do that. So I don't think that's in the same industry. That might disrupt Amazon Prime, although they're probably going to invest in that as well. So, you know, soy versus, you can't even say milk anymore, right? You have to say soy or whatever. But soy versus milk, you know, that's definitely one. Electric cars versus gas cars, that's certainly one. Now, the auto industry is building both, but Valero is still heavily into gasoline. So, and obviously Exxon's worried about, you know, those kind of, you know, turbines and so not every industry has an obvious one. Every industry has this issue, but there may not be an obvious one today to substitute for that. Now, I don't know where AI is going to replace things. There you have to kind of think. None of y'all are doing legal firms. It's possible AI is going to replace a lot of legal firms. AI could replace a lot of medical providers. AI is doing a better job actually finding things. But in other industries, AI is just going to make them better. So for banks, using AI for credit scores might be better than having live credit people looking at the data, So that's not a substitution, and that's not a substitution threat. That's just new technology in the industry. So if the industry is just going to adopt new technology and keep doing similar things but cheaper, that's not a substitute. So you're talking about industry just completely wiping your industry out. Restaurants, it's hard to think of restaurants like that, but you could think HelloFresh is kind of a substitution threat. People getting food delivered at home. I don't consider DoorDash a death. So this is a distinction we made. Someone I was talking to earlier, Mohammed. It was so good. I've talked to so many of y'all. But yeah, I don't consider DoorDash a substitution threat because they don't produce food. So DoorDash is just a new way of delivering. But HelloFresh to me would be a substitution threat. No, because that's already exists. So really here I'm talking about, so someone would say, well, I can eat from home. That's a substitution threat. Yeah, we already have that. People are already doing that. That's not a difference. It's going to be, think this could be a substitution threat. They're talking about these AI robots that can produce high quality chef food from your home. That could be, but they each cost like $10,000 to $20,000. So I don't know who's going to invest that other than billionaires. But yeah, and the chefs are saying, yeah, that robot's producing a meal almost as good as what I'm producing. But that's in this paper, you don't want to get quite that wild, I don't think. So I do think, food being delivered at home could be a substitution threat, definitely. Don't kill your, don't go overboard trying to think of one, because there's a lot of industries that wouldn't have a substitution threat. Okay, we looked at that. All right, so let's finish up with how much. Oh, we're at it. Okay, I'll start here next time. I want to show you this. It's a good summary to put at the end of your paper to bring it all around. All right, let's start. All right, so I have a proposition. See if anyone will take it. Is there anyone who'd be willing to share their draft today, either next Tuesday or Thursday? Is anyone far enough along? Oh, I thought Hawaiian was raising his hand. Okay, all right. Do y'all want to see some drafts? I mean, it would help. Give comments and feedbacks. So think about it. I'll put it in my email and we can see. Part of that's to get you a little nervous that you should be further along than you are, which is always the case this time in the semester. It's really, the class like this, it's really easy. Other classes have stuff. You say, well, I need to do stuff in this class. Well, I can wait till next week. And you end up really far behind. So you got to put time in every single week. All right, well, we'll see. And then the week after next, we're going to have the two outside speakers, Bensi and Jabari. So you can really hear what this industry is really like real life. They both have very, very good jobs doing this kind of stuff. Jabari is about to start, but Bensi's been doing this for some time. So, all right. So last class, we were finishing up the four forces. So this is one I took. These are my words, but I took someone's paper. They were doing, I forget which firm they were doing, but a semiconductor industry company, our semiconductor industry. And so here's their conclusion. So where students lose a lot of points, some students don't do any conclusion at all. They just stop after quarters, where you can't do that. Then other students, they do several pages of Porter, and then their conclusion completely ignores everything they just did. That's pretty bad too. So I'm trying to force you to take all that Porters and say, what does it mean? That's the purpose of Porters, is to give you an overall sense of this industry. And so you put each of the things onto the list, like threats to substitute. You hear it ever since the saying, is that not applicable to this particular one? And look at the title here, impact on industry growth. making it really clear. So don't talk about strong and weak again. Leave that out entirely. So I have the 5 forces, and then I have some keywords here to say what the whole thing means overall. And again, the focus is on growth. So the buyer power, low switching costs. We didn't talk much about switching costs. Switching costs is a huge one. For some of y'all's industries, it's really, really big deal. So like Kimberly is doing Netflix. Switching costs there is almost non-existent. I don't know if y'all try this. I was doing Hulu for a month, Netflix for a month, just back and forth. If a new show came in, and Netflix makes it really easy to cancel. I mean, you can cancel it. It's not like some gym where you have to sign up for a year, right? They're still month to month, aren't they? You can jump in and jump out anytime you want to. So no switching costs whatsoever, piece of cake. That's not good for an industry. Very easy to switch. There's probably people switching between Hulu, Disney, and Netflix all the time. But high switching costs, so Julia, high switching costs is a huge one because, any major theater is going to go to Dolby first. So switching costs is when, especially if in an expensive product and it's a very technical product, there's a lot of training involved. If it's an expensive product, purchasing managers don't like taking a chance on some new products. So a good example, and we'll talk about it here later, we're going to talk about economic modes, but Oracle just dominates the corporate software market, but then Salesforce is coming along where a procurement manager's like, I know Oracle works, people like it, it's not a big deal. If I switch to Salesforce and it doesn't work, I get fired. If I stay with Oracle, I have nothing to worry about. That's that switching cost. Another issue on switching costs is the training. So I remember at USAA, we were looking at 2 investment software packages. And it was the one we had and another one. The one we were looking at to replace was probably the better product. But the whole team said, let's just stick with what we have. And what they're thinking is, if we switch, that's like 50, 100 hours of training to get to the new product. That's all the overtime. You understand it, right? It's the better product, but I don't want to spend all that overtime. And that's the switching cost, all right? So I don't know how many of your firms have that. You have to kind of think through, and I can't remember all of your firms. So UPS, it's pretty easy to switch between UPS and FedEx, right? You just call the other company. Sometimes it's pretty simple. Fast food, really easy to switch between Chipotle and McDonald's. You just drive your car to another block. But if switching costs is important, you want to spend quite a bit of time on it. If it's not important, you can just ignore it. But for some industries, switching costs is a huge, huge, huge deal. All right. Okay, so let's talk about this generic strategy. So Porta says, here's the 5 forces, and then here are the strategies that work within those 5 forces. Now, you might think the generic strategies go to paper 2, but I think generic strategies can work well. And this is something, remember I said under industry rivalry, you might have a table that shows the major competitors. You might think about the generic strategies going there. So Porter says there's 2 main strategies, cost leadership and differentiation. So if you look at your industry, you might ask, is there an obvious cost leader in this industry? Is there an obvious cost leader in semiconductors? Is there an obvious cost leader in airlines? So you think Costco versus Walmart, which of those is the cost leader? Well, I've never compared Costco to Sam's. I don't know how they are. I don't buy stuff in bulk like that. But I don't know which is cheaper. It's pretty easy to tell who's the least expensive. Porter does make the argument that an industry can only have one cost leader. I'm not entirely sure that's true. I mean, is it obvious between Sam's and Costco who's the cost leader? They're both pretty sticklers on expenses, aren't they? They're both going to make sure they're cheap. So I'm not sure if he would still say that today, but so a cost leader is a firm that's focused on volume. It's economies of scale. Whatever they can do to keep prices low, they tend not to have much differentiation. I mean, how many of y'all go to Walmart and says, oh, I'm really going to Walmart. I mean, the ambience, it's just such a nice environment, people, you got the Walmart greeter. I've never had a good experience with the Walmart greeter. They're always like distracted. I've had good experience with Costco greeters. Costco's doing something. Their employees seem to love them. How do they do that? That is a differentiation. We'll talk about that. But essentially, you're not going to notice much of that because they got to keep their costs down. So when we see differentiation, something Porter says I think is really, really important. Differentiation almost always costs you money, almost always raises your expenses. And so these firms don't like differentiation because they don't want to spend the money. Now, if Costco, what do you know about Costco? They pay their workers really well. Now, why do they do that? So we'll have to, get through that, talking about turnover versus your hourly pay. So it may not be perfect. There may be some firms finding some ways to get a little bit of differentiation without a lot of extra costs and getting a big benefit from that. Their product can't be so low quality as they get a reputation for low quality. And you can tell when you've gone too far. You probably never heard of the Yugo. Have y'all heard of the Yugo? So that was a car Russia was making and producing. So when do you know when they lost on the quality side, when late night television programs, that's the butt of their joke. When your product is the example of really low quality, you've gone too far. So you have to be careful. China is kind of going through that now with their EVs because they've had some really serious problems with their EVs in the US. You get that reputation and it kind of snowballs on you. You almost can't come back from that. It's really, really tough to do. So you can't be so inferior you become the butt of jokes. So does your industry have one? So like in airlines, you must say Ryanair is the cost leader, but then you have the Spirit and you got the Southwest. Who's really the cost leader? It's really hard to say in that kind of industry. Some might be regional cost leaders, but not national. I don't know if does Ryan fly into the United States? They must fly here somewhere, don't they? In New York or somewhere? I don't know. But definitely a cost leader has done it really, really well. And the interesting thing with Spirit and Southwest, so Southwest, really interesting story. They were mainly in Texas, and Texans were used to Southwest. The hassle of no assigned seat, some of the luggage issues. People in Texas, they just, it's Southwest, it's a Texas company, they're cheaper. We know we're gonna have a hassle. And then they go to California, where California's like, who's this garbage company coming here? We don't have our own assigned seats. And so what Southwest had to do, and Spirit has done the same thing, is you make a joke about those things. Spirit has done that a lot. He's like, you're not buying air tickets because you love air flight. You're buying air tickets because you want to go on vacation. So we're cheaper. Yeah, we're a hassle. We nickel and dime you, but you're still, after we nickel and dime you, you're still cheaper. And that gives you an extra $300 to spend when you get to where you're really going, is your own vacation. They make fun of themselves. That's the way you kind of have to do it, is to get people used to, it's not an inferior product. It's a product that just doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but you pay a lot less. Your customer better be ready for that, because you can't have that kind of bad reputation. And cost leaders. So this is the other thing that's really important when you talk about generic strategies, especially for paper two. If your firm has some advantage, if it's a cost advantage, a differentiation, some economic moat, that's where their CapEx should be focused. So if Walmart's advantage is cost leadership, their CapEx should be spending money on keeping their costs down. I know people complain about the self-service lanes. I love them. They save me time. I laugh when I see on Facebook, like, I'm not trained to do my own checkout. It's like, it takes you like, what, 3 seconds to train on the self-checkout. It's pretty easy, pretty good technology. How much money does it save Walmart? I don't know, but they're going to do those kind of things. There's some thought that we may not have cashiers at all at some point. Who knows? But they're going to figure that kind of thing out before anybody else, because they got to get their costs down. That's where their CapEx shouldn't be on some frills. They shouldn't be buying corporate jets and those kind of things. They should be focused on cost leadership. Now, I don't know if there's any cost leaders in here, because no one's doing. Any of y'all think you have a cost leader? I mean, Chipotle certainly isn't. UPS and FedEx, I don't know if there is a cost leader in that industry. Can y'all think of anyone in here that's a cost leader? So it may not, and certainly Dolby's not. So I can't remember some of y'all's companies, but the other question is, if your firm's not the cost leader, is there a cost leader? So it's possible you have an industry that's not an obvious thing. So Walmart, Costco, Southwest Airlines. All right, then you get the differentiation. Here's where you have a lot more you can talk about. So the key with differentiation, you can't just do differentiation because you like to be different. Differentiation allows you to charge more. So there's got to be additional premium. The kind of analysis you really want to do, which is hard to do, I think Business Breakdown actually does a pretty good job of this, is how much does it cost you to create the differentiation versus how much more revenue are you getting? If it costs you $5 to create it, but you get $7 extra, then it's worth it. If it's $5 and $5, it's almost not worth it. So what is it that you are doing that is making people see your product different, and then how much you're spending on it? So for Nike, is it the quality of the shoe, or is it the advertising? Are Nikes really better than Adidas and Reebok? Or does Nike just target the marketing in a way, which is, I have no idea because I don't play basketball. You wouldn't be able to tell if you put different shoes on me. I look just as bad either way. So I don't know. I can't really tell. Can professional athletes tell? I mean, if you put Nikes and Adidas and Reeboks on a professional athlete and didn't tell them, could they run and tell which shoe they were wearing? I don't know. But if it's all advertising, that can work. But we'll talk about that a little bit more. The kind of the customer doesn't care about the quality of the shoe. They just want the prestige of wearing that product. It's the affinity kind of thing. So where can differentiation come from? It can be the product itself, the product's quality, the product's durability. It can be the product's features and functionality. It can be the service and support they provide, and it can just be that affinity, the brand image. They provide something that people like to be associated with, and they're willing to pay a little bit more for that. When you go to HEB and there's HEB ketchup and there's Heinz ketchup, which one's more expensive? The Heinz. Is that enough? You're spending more. How much more are you spending? Do you check that? Probably not much. A few pennies. You don't really notice it. Is that enough to induce you? Why do you buy that brand? If you don't know one's better than the other, why would you spend an extra few pennies? What about salt? HEB has their salt. You have Morton. What salt do you buy? I buy HEB. It's like 1 penny cheaper. Saves me a penny. I'll never know. I can't tell the difference between salt brands, but there is that brand image there that you have. It was funny at the HEB there. The HEB ketchup was like twice as expensive as Hunt's. And the lady was standing there. I knew what she was thinking. I go, yeah, the Hunt's is cheaper. She goes, yeah, it's a lot cheaper. What's going on? I don't get it. I said, no, it's cheaper. I don't know. They have some pricing problem or something. She stood there like for 20 minutes trying to figure out why is Hunt's cheaper than the HEB brand. I don't know what she ended up doing. I just grabbed the Hunt's because it was cheaper. So we're going to talk a little bit more about branding. Branding is a pretty important concept, pretty important topic. I think with Dolby, obviously the brand's there and the product quality is probably there too. And they can probably prove it. So that one's probably pretty straightforward. So, Chipotle, Dante, I don't know, on Chipotle, the product quality is probably there and they advertise that pretty hard, right? They're talking about like no GMO or what else do they do? No processed foods, whatever they do. So Subway kind of was doing that as well. How much more does that cost them to do that? They can obviously charge more than a McDonald's, but how much more does it cost them to do that kind of sourcing of their product? So think through this, and it's not just your company, but the industry itself. How does the industry differentiate itself between different players? What are those key attributes? So why do you go to Home Depot instead of Lowe's? Do y'all know the answer to that? Is it location or is it anything else? If you can't answer that question, there's no differentiation. All right. That was the case with banking for the longest time. We had banks coming in left and right. A bunch of guys. There's always guys. There's very few women in banking back then. All in dark blue suits, white shirts, red ties. They all came in. We asked them a question: why should we hire you instead of JP Morgan? And they said, well, we're just really, really good. I said, okay. And then JP Morgan comes in. Oh, we're just really, really good. They could not give us one reason why they were better than competitors, and you could just flip a coin at the end of the day because you couldn't tell the difference. That's an industry that's what Porter says is stuck in the middle. You can't differentiate them. But that's what you want to think about with your firm. Why do people use your firm, or not your firm, the firm you're analyzing? So don't get wedded to your firm. Why do customers pick the firm you're analyzing versus another firm? So making the product unique can't cost more than that extra price you're getting. And then where do you invest your CapEx? It's to keep that differentiation there. Make sure that's there. You can invest to save money as well, but you've got to make sure you're investing to preserve that uniqueness of your product. All right, so the class notes talk about differentiation, the product itself, from marketing, from service, location, convenience, being online. Now when you have things like curbside pickup and home delivery and those type of things. So Walmart's big thing is order online and pick it up at the curb. That saves you some time. That certainly makes sense, especially certain items where you just, you know exactly what you want. You just want to pick it up, not have to stand in line, go inside the building. So that can be a convenience. Walmart has a huge advantage on that because they have a lot more stores than Amazon does. Brand identity, we'll talk a little bit more. Exclusivity, things like patent rights, first to market, those kind of things that can, you're the only one that has the product, obviously, that makes you different and unique. Luis is not here. Pharmaceuticals, patent rights, but then, does one drug work better than another? And that's kind of hard. Most of us probably does whatever the doctor recommends, and so then the differentiation is how to get doctors to recommend their product. All right, so find some way to talk about this in paper one for the industry, not for your company, and then when you get to your company, it'll be a pretty smooth transition into your company to explain how they're different than everybody else. And I really think business breakdown should help you quite a bit on that. All right, so let's talk some on brands. So brands can be the most valuable asset many companies possess. No one agrees how much they're worth. Now, there's some debate on that. So something you might try, I have some links in the notes, but they're really dated. So let's see if we can find it. So you can actually do the value of a brand. I forget the firms actually do this. What's your brand worth? Brand value calculator. So there's two places. I think I mentioned them in the notes. I can't remember if I put them in here. They're in the class notes though. They give you links. And I think, let me find the class notes real quick because I'm pretty sure I put it in there. There are firms that actually value brands. They put a dollar amount on it. How much is Google's brand worth? How much is McDonald's brand worth? How much is Coca-Cola's brand worth? I think all of your firms have pretty significant brand. Yeah, I'm not seeing my links in here. I'll have to find them because I had them before. All right, so there are websites, there are firms, there's two particular firms that put values on brands, and I'm not seeing them here. So how do you value a brand? And it's actually pretty straightforward. What you do is you figure out the additional gross margin that brand produces. So it's the additional price minus additional cost, and it's the present value of that additional gross margin over the life of the firm. That's what it is. It's just a present value. Very, very subjective, right? So you gotta figure out how much more do they charge and how much more does it cost them, and that net is what they're looking for. So firms with good brand identity should have higher gross margins than firms with bad brand identity. That should be part of the analysis. Sometimes you see brands on the balance sheet, sometimes you don't. But I mean, Coca-Cola may have some trademarks on their balance sheet, but that's not the value of the brand. I mean, they may have completely amortized their trademark on Coca-Cola, but they're not going to give that away to you. That's going to be highly, and that's one of the most recognizable brands out there. I don't know why I took that. I may have an article off. I think that's what it was, is an economics article that had tables that compared brand value. So I'll find that article and we can talk it next class. All right. And then the last strategy Porter's has, so he has cost leadership, differentiation, and then he says there's some firms that do one of those two, but they're very concentrated on a very select market. That's called focus. Focus cost leadership or focus differentiation. You find a niche market and then you build brand loyalty there. So you've got to commit to that market, to understand that market, make sure you know what their needs are. So USA was like this for quite some time, and being the military go-to for military officers. And they kind of lost that, and then Bob Davis came in and refocused them on that. And they did a lot of training on the phone. If you had an officer call in, you better use their correct name or whatever you're supposed to call them. I knew nothing about the military, even though I worked there. So you have to understand that market, be real unique. One mistake focus type of businesses do is they try to expand too quickly to other markets, and they start losing that uniqueness with their focus markets. So you got to make sure you don't move too fast. So if you expand too quickly, first of all, you may become the target of the leader in that market, and they're going to take you out. They'll let you survive as focus as long as you stay with your particular core market. And once you start going out to other markets, they start attacking you pretty hard. Or you just lose that niche because your market might love your firm, the firm you're analyzing. They may like it because of that uniqueness of being associated with them. And now as you expand out. So what happens to Tesla when they start offering $40,000 cars? Aren't Tesla, and some of y'all own Teslas, so I probably shouldn't say, but Tesla people are like really proud they own Teslas, right? These $70,000, $80,000 cars. They drive and look at me, I'm driving a Tesla. What happens when you start seeing a bunch of people riding $40,000 Teslas? Do the 70,000 people start saying, hey, wait a minute. So a good example is Ferrari. How many of y'all own a Ferrari? I bet more of y'all own Teslas than Ferraris. But Ferrari doesn't make many cars. And why not? Because they cost them what, $100,000 or something, or even more than that. They make very few. Their margins are massive. Very focused on one particular market, very differentiated product. That's all they're going to do. They're not going to offer a $60,000 Ferrari. That would destroy their market. They're going to stick with what they do very, very well. So most of you are picking really big global type firms that probably, Exxon is not a focus niche market firm. It does everything. So most of you are probably not in this field. You can be focused cost leadership, so you may not be the lowest cost, but for that niche market that you're serving, you provide them a unique product that meets their needs, but you're cheaper than the really high-end product. But you better know your market extremely, extremely well. All right, so that's Porter's. That's mainly paper one. Economic Moats has a high overlap with Porter's. It's more for paper two. So for paper two, a lot of stuff you talked in paper one, especially on differentiation, when you come into paper two, you're going to get really specific about your firm and ask, does your firm have an economic moat? Have y'all heard that term batted around somewhat? It's a Warren Buffett type of term. The overlaps there's another template I might talk to you about. Is a book I just read. I heard this guy on my podcast, so I got his book. It's a lot of overlap with Porter's there as well. So a lot of people, Porter's kind of set the stage, and people kind of like tweaking around the edges. But economic moats, are important for your paper too. Economic moats give you pricing power, allows you the essentially price, maybe not monopoly power, but your ability to price more than perfect competition. You can pay, you can charge more than you probably should in a true pure competition type of market. It's part of the business itself. So economic moat is just part of the business. You can't separate it out. And it insulates the firm from competition. So a firm that has economic moats should have better margins, should have higher return on capital. You should notice it. They should be more profitable if they truly have that. Is an intangible asset. You're not going to find another balance sheet anywhere. And what happens with firms with economic moats, when you value them, they're going to look expensive. They're going to look like expensive stocks. But they're really not, because they have something that gives them an extra return that they can sustain for a long period of time. Economic moats tend to be found in certain industries more than others. So some of y'all may not have an economic moat. I don't know if Exxon really has an economic moat other than just their massive size. So here's Warren Buffett. No formula in finance tells you that the moat is 28 feet by 16. That's what drives the academics crazy. They can compute standard deviations and betas, but they cannot understand moats. So it's a big deal from him, from his standpoint. Well, he still looks the same today. That picture is probably 10 years old, but once you hit 85, you just stop aging. All right. So what are the sources? The first one under Porter's, you would probably think of as an entry barrier. So patents, licenses, exclusive distribution systems. This is what most people think of as an economic moat. The problem is a patent and a license. Those are things the government gives you, and the government doesn't like giving you those things. And so there's going to be some restrictions. An exclusive distribution system, if you are a utility, and so you're a monopoly. Yeah, the government says you're a monopoly. You're the only one that can work here, but we're going to tell you how much money you can make. Very, very restrictive. So you may not like the other side of the equation. So you usually have a lot of regulation. Government knows this gives you special powers, and so they may somehow restrict how much you can charge, how much you can make. Utilities get that monopoly, but they don't get huge returns as a result. Exclusive distribution systems can be a strong moat, but they can generate lawsuits. We've seen that with Alphabet, and especially in Europe, saying, "Hey, Alphabet, you've got to let competition come in. You can't tell people that if you do certain things, we're not going to support you. You have to open up to other people." Apple and Samsung. There's a lot of these companies have had these type of restrictive distribution systems being challenged in court, and in fact, they're suing each other. They both sue each other, both directions, for all kinds of stuff. So it's an expensive moat to maintain. Patents, licenses, contracts, they do provide protection, but they have restrictions, so they limit the firm's ability to sustain these returns. Pharmaceuticals, they have patents, but when the patent runs out, everybody can come in. Now, pharmaceuticals have gotten really good that when the patent runs out, they'll make a small tweak to the pill, so they get a new patent and they can start all over again. So they've gotten pretty good at getting around the system, but it's not as valuable of a moat as you might think. All right, so let's talk brand again. This might be where I have the chart I was looking for. I can't remember where I put it, but so brand identity can give you firm pricing power for 3 reasons. One is status, that affinity. You just want to be associated with that product. So a lot of luxury goods fall into that category. Tiffany, I don't know, Tiffany was going to get bought out, went private. I don't know where they are now. I don't think Tiffany's publicly traded right now.
They're owned by.
Yeah, I think Brian talked about that, didn't he, last semester? So yeah. Does Tiffany still have that image? If someone walked in with a Tiffany box and handed it to you, would you think, okay, they spent at least $1,000? So it could work. I want one of those boxes so I can put something fake in it. I was in New York and the guy was selling Rolexes on the street for like $15. Man, I wish I got one because it would have made a great white elephant gift. You wrap it up a Rolex and hey, I bought you a Rolex, but I was like felt too stupid buying a Rolex. I was worried the guy would think I thought it was real, and then it was like, ah, that guy's really stupid. But that's the status side of it. The Ferrari, the Rolls Royce, the Tiffany's, and I don't know luxury brands because obviously I never buy them. But the second one is trust. The brand identity is they've been successful in the past. So rating agencies like Moody's and S&P, if they say something's AAA, it's highly unlikely to default. They say it's triple C or single C, it's highly likely to default. You can create that trust. I think that's where USAA was for years, and I think they've kind of lost that. Where USAA, they could charge a little more. They tried to be competitive, but you could just trust them. They weren't going to rip you off. You could, if you bought the life insurance, it was well priced, those kind of things. I think all entities, when they get really, really, really large, it's hard to maintain the economic moat. Vanguard is one of my favorite, and Vanguard has that trust aspect, but they're getting really, really large too, so I worry about them as well. Once you get to such a massive size, it's hard to keep everybody focused on what really got them there. And then it reduces buyer search time, so that's what I was talking about before. Is ketchup ketchup? If you're not sure, then buy, the name brand, then it's pretty good. My experience with HEB is it's kind of a mix. I bought their Greek yogurt and threw it all away, and I never throw food away. It was so horrible. I just threw it all away. That was terrible. But other products I bought are really, really good. So you have to kind of try it. So, you kind of build that trust or experiment and see which is better. But if you're not sure, you go with the trusted, if you're overseas and you see a McDonald's, you know what you're going to get. It's pretty straightforward. It's a brand. When I was in Greece, I was so sick and tired of Greek food. I just couldn't take it anymore. So we're across from the Pantheon eating at McDonald's and thinking, boy, that's kind of stupid, or not the Pantheon, well, whatever. I get the one in Rome and the one in, but anyway, there's a McDonald's there. And I thought, well, it's horrible. This McDonald's is sitting in this famous historic place, but I want to eat there because I'm sick and tired of the food. Because you know what it is, you understand the product, you trust it. So, so Tiffany's, Moody's, maybe Tide and Kellogg's, those kind of things. So brand identity, your CapEx, you know what CapEx is, capital expenditures, your investment should focus on product recognition. So a lot on marketing, making sure people are aware of your product. But brand identity is less valuable than it used to be because of all these influencers. I even talk about an influencer, the people I'm working with in Costa Rica want to start a new business. And I'm worried about them attracting business. And I tell them, find someone in San Jose that's a well-known influencer, pay them $1,000 to come try out your product, do some videos. I think it'd be worth it. You get that just immediate recognition. It's a lot cheaper than advertising. You got one person and they've done all the work for you. It's a very different world today where you can get that kind of an immediate viral kind of sensation. And you're a Kellogg's, and you've been doing that for years and years and years. And then someone creates a new cereal and some influencer really loves it and eats it. And suddenly everybody's buying that product overnight. It's a very, very different world because of the internet. Many companies that used to rely on brand are struggling in this environment. It's difficult because you have to do some innovation. It can use up a lot of capital. Y'all probably don't even know this company, do y'all? How many of y'all been in this company before? Oh, even you young kids, okay. That was brand recognition. They had a jingle that everybody knew and all those kind of things, but they went out of business. Seems like an awfully valuable brand that just let it die and go away, but they couldn't get it to work because of the Walmarts and the internet and everything else. So if brand is your thing, you got to make sure that there's a perception the product is superior, but it also needs to in some way be superior. Because eventually you're gonna lose out on that. So, and she told me she had to leave early, so she's fine. I appreciate that if they leave early and you let me know, I really appreciate it. Makes me feel better. So maybe is Tiffany's stuff really better than anybody else's? The advantage they have is that name recognition, but could someone else come along and take that? You know, that's the kind of thing you have to think about. But they need to somehow maintain their CapEx so that they protect whatever that thing is. I think that's the USA's biggest issue is they had it solid, and then their bank hit the headlines with all these fines from the regulators and all that kind of, you know, things can topple pretty quickly if you don't maintain that. All right, here's switching costs again. The product is integral to the customer's operations. That's pretty important. It's got to be a big deal to the customer. It's complex. So retraining is costly. It's inconvenient to switch. Those kind of things give you a huge advantage. They have competitors, but the competitors' products have to be obviously superior for the person to switch. And I don't know, Julie, have you found who's number 2 in your industry? Is it obvious? Who? UTS. I don't. Okay. They produce speakers and. Yeah, I mean, I bet there's a lot of real cheap producers, you know, the kind of fake. But yeah, I mean, you've got number 1 and number 2 is way down there. That gives them a huge advantage, but they got to do CapEx to maintain that, whatever that is. And it sounds like that they're investing to stay up there. So Oracle, you know, at USAA, everything was Oracle. That's all we had. We had PeopleSoft, and then what happened to PeopleSoft? They got bought by Oracle. So, and I remember when Oracle bought PeopleSoft, the IT people at USAA, they were all cussing. They hated Oracle. It's like, I don't want to deal with Oracle. They love PeopleSoft. They hate Oracle. And Oracle had that reputation like, hey, take us or leave us. But if you leave us, there's no one there to go to. So take us or leave. And they had this arrogance to them. They've been trying to work on that reputation because Salesforce is coming in pretty strong. One thing that you could do that's really valuable in something like this, if you can find it, is find the procurement manager at a large firm that buys the product that you're analyzing and ask them how they make their decision. That would be real. Don't you wish you know, if you're doing Oracle, you could sit down with the procurement person at USAA. Why do you use Oracle? Have you thought about switching? What would you do with switching? I understand, because that's the key to your product. So who is the decision maker for the product and what are their incentives? And if you think through that, then you'll have a good understanding of that economic moat. How sustainable is that? Adobe on the desktop publishing side. So switching costs, they need to focus reinvestment on functionality. They got to make sure their product works very well. They got to stay equal to or ahead of their competitor. They can't let their competitor gain on them and get ahead. The advantage of something like Oracle and Salesforce is obviously they know each other's products really well. What do these two firms do? They hire each other's employees. I was in New York at Credit Suisse, and they were all high-fiving each other. I was like, what happened? And he said, oh, we just hired a key employee from the final hedge fund we compete against. So we now have an employee from every one of our competitors. It's like, oh, that's an interesting approach. And they're really excited about it. It's like they're trying to steal employees from the main. So I don't know if Oracle and Salesforce intentionally do that, but I certainly would if I were working for them to get that inside story. So do you know people like that? I don't know. Some of your businesses, I don't know, Julie, you could go to a AMC and ask them, why do you use Dolby? How much, you know, who made that decision? That's probably not the right level, right? You have to go to their corporate office, but that would be a really good, interesting conversation to have. All right, so the platform and network, that's a huge one. More users on the platform creates better experience for the users. also creates more incentive for advertisers. As you get more users, it attracts more users, and just kind of goes and goes and goes. Google as a search engine, Amazon for online ordering, Facebook for a social media. eBay used to be, right? They've kind of lost their. Do y'all use eBay now? Anybody? A little bit, some, but it used to be the only place, right? Now you have, even Facebook has their market, which I've actually gone on Facebook's market a few times. I almost bought a bike on Facebook, but the guy selling it was a good friend, so he just drove by and gave it to me. We had a transaction in the alleyway. So, there's more and more competitors in these areas, but being the biggest one gives you a huge advantage. You could say the same thing about Uber and Lyft and those type of businesses. This has become a much, much bigger deal. So you focus your reinvestment on the experience. So Facebook, I haven't noticed as much, but Facebook every year they did something new that would try to get you engaged in their product. They did have the avatar. Was that Facebook? Was that Facebook doing the avatar, or was it some other?
Facebook, the Oculus.
Huh?
The Oculus.
Oh, is that what it's called? I don't.
Yeah.
I thought it was your own personal avatar, but is it something else? Am I saying it wrong?
Yeah.
And they used to have your year in review. Y'all probably don't remember that when they did the video of that. That kind of got old, but it was kind of cool for the first 3 minutes. But they're trying because if you're not engaged on Facebook, you're going to forget about it and not stay on for a few weeks. You're going to stop using it. The advertisers, Facebook is all about active users. So you got to get people active. So you add features continuously. So CapEx should be on that side of the features. Obviously, all of these firms are spending a fortune on AI and are letting the AI try to figure out where that engagement is, and almost scary. I'm reading Henry Kissinger's book on AI. I just finished a chapter on AI warfare, and it is freaky scary, really scary. I mean, AI jet pilots are doing better in mock wars than the actual pilots are. And it's really a freak, and they don't know why. That's the thing that's scary about AI. AI's figured out how to do it better, and the people don't know exactly what AI is. And that's true with chess. They don't know why AI is winning, but it's winning. So it's really freaky. So AI is going to figure out, they don't know why you clicked on something, but they notice when you click on something, you do these other 3 things, and so do these people, and so these people, and they're going to figure you out. And it's going to be freaky. Scary. I don't know how when I do an email that I need new shoes and suddenly Facebook's advertising shoes. That just really bothers me. But anyway, the other thing you've got to do is a threat has got to be taken out. So you buy your competitors, and they do that. All of these firms buy their competitors pretty rapidly. Used to be my thing is, if you can find the next Microsoft, you invest in 20 firms, one of them's Microsoft and 19 of them go out of business, you'll still make a fortune. That's not true anymore, because the 19 that go out of business, you lose money, and the one that's Microsoft gets bought out by Google or Facebook before they become a multi-billion, and you don't win. So it's hard to find these new big, Tesla's pretty amazing story. But it's hard to find those. This is one of the big issues Europe has had. Europe has had a tough time producing these platform firms, the Googles and Facebooks of the world. They just have really struggled in creating that. China is doing a pretty good job with Tencent and Alibaba, and they've done a good job there. But it's if you can get it done, you're going to make a fortune. But once you get there, you've got to invest to keep it going. Economies of scale is in both quarters and in economic moats. Economies of scale is just, you have a lot of capital plant and equipment, and you have to maintain that. So that's where your CapEx has got to be. You got to keep that equipment up to date, current. You look at someone like a Valero. They have these massive refiners. They've got to keep them in shape, keep them new, make sure they've got the latest technology, but that's a huge advantage. You're not going to create that from scratch. One thing with economies of scale is you got to expand it beyond just property, plant, and equipment. You have to think in terms of scope as well. So NVIDIA may not have a lot of property, plant, and equipment, but they've invested a lot in the knowledge base and their employees, what they know that their competitors don't. That's a huge investment, and they've got to keep that investment in place. They got to make sure their employees don't go to the competitors, that they keep them there. So you build this detailed knowledge base of a market or some unique experience, and it's just impossible to replicate unless you hire people's employees away from them. And I don't know what AI is going to be doing to this. AI may be disrupting a lot of this stuff as well. So the CapEx for the property, plant, and equipment is making sure you keep that stuff in good working condition. On the scope side, your CapEx is going to be guarding that deep knowledge base, building on it. So Intel, I had Intel up there. Intel, huge CapEx on these major fabrication plants. They've spent billions of dollars on those things. But Intel also has invested a lot in their knowledge base, where they would cannibalize their own products, keep ahead of themselves, that kind of thing. They've kind of lost that now with these Taiwanese companies, but NVIDIA obviously, and I put NVIDIA up there before their last earnings release, which was a pretty amazing earnings release. But obviously AI is starting to take off. They have a knowledge base that most others don't have. Yeah, that's hard to replicate. So think of it in two ways. What is the economic moat? And then what CapEx do they need to be able to protect that? Because we're talking about sustainability. What do they have to do? You're going to have to spend money to protect that moat. Questions on moats? I'm trying to think how many of y'all have a platform moat. So Netflix might. They're trying to, right? Producing their own programming. They're trying to. It's awfully expensive though. Wow, that's a massive cost. And I don't know, Kimberly, if you're probably gonna spend some time on the strike and talking about how that impact is on them. But they're spending a lot of money and just producing new programming. That should give them an advantage. A firm like Paramount, I don't know how Paramount's online streaming is going, but they've got a lot of old movies and TV shows that no one else has access to. That's somewhat of protection. But then what is your CapEx? So do ask the question, make sure in your notes you ask the question, what are they actually spending their money on in CapEx? If you haven't thought about that, make sure you think about that. Now, some of the business breakdowns, they spend quite a bit of time on that. Not all of them, but a few of them spend quite a bit of time. What is their CapEx? Their CapEx is on this. So a good example was Peloton. So a huge problem Peloton was having was in the music on the background of their exercises, because they're having to pay these massive royalties. So they decided to create their own music and actually get new artists coming in. You think about those kind of things, that CapEx is, what are they spending the money on? You say, well, that's interesting. They're trying to avoid that heavy expense of the royalties by doing that CapEx, but ask those questions. So obviously with Netflix, it's new programming. That's pretty straightforward. Is there anything else in there that's doing? For Chipotle, it's probably new stores. It might be ghost kitchens, but what else might it be? What are they spending money on? Okay, with economies of scale, firms should focus on reinvestment, maintaining and building on their manufacturing intellectual investments. Avoid obsolescence over time. You gotta stay ahead of the curve. One thing to look at with your firm and capital IQ. I don't know if y'all having trouble with capital IQ. I should probably tell y'all this now. So I think I published it. Let me make sure. So on Canvas, this very first file, if you're not getting capital IQ to work, it wasn't working in the lab. but I discovered they have some UTSA logins that you can use. So I've given you the UTSA login. Where is it? Where did it go? I don't see it. There it is. So if you're on any of the computers in FSC, if you use these logins, it should get you in there. So if you aren't having success with or if you have a Mac instead of a PC, I tried one of them, it worked. So I haven't tried on every machine, but it did get me in and it worked. My own personal ID will not get me in the FSC. Luis is not here, but somehow Luis got in on his personal ID. When I told the IT people that, they're like, I don't know how you did that, but so it's a little finicky, but I was able to get in with this. So why would Capital IQ be important? Well, CapEx is something you can pull from Capital IQ, and you might want to look at it over time, maybe look at it as percentage of revenues, percentage of cash from operations, something you can compare it. And in paper one, you might want to do that. If you've got 4 or 5 main companies, you might want to bring, it's pretty easy once you get it set up in Capital IQ to bring in the revenue and the CapEx for those 5 companies and just see what's the trend. Are they constantly doing 20% of revenues, 40% of revenues? What are they doing? You could bring in their EBITDA, see what percentage of their earnings is being reinvested in the firm. There's some firms, if their EBITDA is $1 billion, their CapEx is $1 billion. They're reinvesting everything back into the firm. So you might want to look at that. Is one thing that could be interesting if you have 5 main competitors, how similar are they when it comes to CapEx? Are they all pretty much the same or are they radically different? That can be really, really quite insightful. And so CapEx will do that for you. That can work on paper one, and then on paper two, you specifically look at your firm's CapEx and try to figure out what they're doing with that money. We know there's a lot of firms that are buying their stock back, paying dividends. So instead of CapEx, they're just giving the money back to the investors. But even then, you want to ask, what did they used to do CapEx on that they're not doing now? Why are they cutting back? Where is that going? All right, y'all understand this? There's your login. The reason we have multiple of them is I don't think you can have 2 going at the same time. So, so hopefully they actually have 30 of them, but these are the only ones that are working. So Capital IQ keeps breaking down on us in all different ways. But she said these should all be working. All right. So there maybe needs to be a CapEx on paper one. Where would it fall in paper one? I would probably put it under barriers to entry, maybe. That might be important part of it. And then you definitely want to talk about CapEx on paper 2 or 3. Kind of depends. We'll talk paper 3 here. Paper 3 is where you're just looking at the numbers, but paper 2, you're talking about economic moats. So CapEx is something you talk about when you're talking about economic moats. All right, so this was a podcast. This guy, Pat Dorsey, was interviewed. I thought it was a really, really good interview. So I went out and bought his book, and his book wasn't any good at all. So I kind of waited. I was hoping to put as an entire book on economic moats because he was really, really insightful on economic moats. But that was just one chapter, and the chapter said exactly what he said in this podcast. So it was kind of a waste. And the other chapters were not good at all. But Pat Dorsey has a firm that their entire thing is economic moats. That's what they do. They're buying firms with economic moats. So that's why he talked about it so much. Smart guy, but just the book was not all that good. So this process, he's trying to find firms with economic moats. If a firm has an economic moat, they should have good profitability. So if you have a moat, but you're not making money off of it, then it's kind of a waste. You want to say figure out what that source of profitability is. Why do they make more money than everybody else? And what's keeping the competitors away? That is your economic moat. So you start with firms with strong profitability. It doesn't mean that every firm with strong profitability has an economic moat. But he's saying if they don't have strong profitability, there's probably no reason to look for an economic moat there because it's not coming to fruition. So find a firm with strong profitability. How would you do that with your firm? Well, profitability is pretty straightforward. It's return on invested capital. So you can bring the return on invested capital in your firm versus the competitors and just see, are they consistently higher on return on invested capital? So if the industry is making 8% return on capital and your firm's making 10, 11%, there's a good chance they have an economic moat, especially if it's been like that over time. So once you figure out they do have excess profitability, try to figure out what is that source and what's keeping the competitors down. How long can they hold off their competitors? So if you're a pharmaceutical and you have some patent, when does that patent run off? That kind of thing. Then your Porter's 5 forces is part of that analysis. And the things he said he's learned is the number of the moats is not as important as the strength of the moat. One strong moat is much better than 2 or 3 kind of mediocre moats. All right. And then we just talked about this. Ask if the firm's reinvestment into the moat is making it more profitable. So that CapEx is so important. Now he says there are some firms that have economic moats, but they're static. So what the best firm it has an economic moat and their reinvestment, their CapEx is making it more valuable. That's the best kind of firm. But some firms have an economic moat, like a Coca-Cola, and the reinvestment only maintains it. That can be good if the company's cheap. That's like a really good cash cow. You know, you just got this thing that it's not growing, it's not getting better, but it's still really profitable, giving you good cash flows. And they have an economic moat, so it is protecting them somewhat. It's just not a growing market, especially Coca-Cola, because people aren't drinking sodas the way they used to, but they still have that brand identity. So even if the moat's static, buying the stock can make sense if the stock is cheap and the moat is still there and still strong. And we've already talked about this, CapEx. If you find an economic moat, management better be investing against that moat. And then you allocate capital to strengthen the moat. Well, you're not looking just for firms with good return on capital, but you actually, what he's saying is good return on capital that is increasing. Now, you have a huge problem because of COVID. So you got some noise in the numbers. So I don't know how you kind of get around that noise. 2020 just kind of jumps for everybody. Sometimes it jumps down, sometimes it jumps up if you're like Zoom or Moderna. But yeah, that can kind of mess it up. But look at 2021, 2022. 2022, you had the inflation, so you've had some noise, so it's a little tough to ask. But you can at least ask, is your firm's profitability higher than the competitors? And why is that? And how are they reinvesting to kind of maintain that? And then, as he said, it kind of been in a few industries, payment processors like Visa and MasterCard. So I forget who's doing Visa. Someone here, are you doing Visa? Yeah, so definitely economic moat. I don't know how Visa reinvests. Obviously, their strength is signing up vendors, making that as easy as possible. So hopefully they're reinvesting to make it as easy for vendors to sign up as possible. I don't know if they're doing that. So payment processors, business to business software developers like the Oracle types, that's an economic moat. You're going to reinvest in making the software as functional as possible. Investment markets, none of y'all picked the investment market, but boy, it was so interesting. The Chicago Board of Option Exchange, CBOE, that's really fascinating. They're interesting. They're somewhat monopolies. They have huge advantages versus everybody else just because kind of that trust kind of nature of that economic moat. But then how are they investing? So how many of y'all think you have a strong economic moat? Well, obviously, Dolby. What firm are you doing? Deere. Oh, yeah, Deere. So Deere is a great example of, we were talking about, when your customers are wearing your baseball cap with great pride, and they're probably making fun of anyone who comes in with a different cap on, that's pretty good sign that you've got an economic moat. There's a switching cost. We talked about that, huge switching cost with Deere, brand recognition. So how does Deere reinvest? What do they focus in? Are they focused on the AI right now, which is a big deal for them, that functionality, staying ahead of the competition? Yeah, deer is definitely in that. Anybody else have an obvious one? So UNP, it's interesting. Rail lines, I don't understand it entirely, but obviously you got to figure out who gets to use which tracks and why, and who pays for what, and that kind of advantage. Someone was talking about the huge advantage of railroads versus trucking is that you can ship so much at once. This massive, massive thing. But you can't have 6 railroads competing all in the same spot because there's only 2 tracks. So there's probably some economic moat there. And that's what we talked quite a bit about. What is their CapEx? It's really hard to figure it out. What are they spending their money on? So that would be an interesting thing to research. So somehow figure out how to get economic moats in there, even if it's a discussion of, I don't think my firm has an economic moat. Anything they do is easy to replicate by other firms. Just think about it. Chipotle probably has some brand recognition, but restaurants, that can fade really fast. Mainly because tastes change. You think about the Gap, and I don't know when's the last time y'all shopped at the Gap, but it was real popular and suddenly it wasn't. They had one season they missed, and boy, they crushed them. So if you miss one, it may not even been a bad decision. They just might have been just perfectly unlucky. They just pushed the wrong clothing and that shot them down. So it can change fast. That's not a good economic moat. All right, here's another one, Conrad Leonard. Firms with moats can be classified as legacy moats, reinvestment moats, and capital-light compounders. A legacy moat is oftentimes the brand name. It's just always been there. You always think about them, like a Tiffany's. They just come to mind first when you think of that particular product. He says legacy moats, there's not a lot of good reinvestment opportunities. Maybe it's marketing, but there's nothing obvious that's so you've got what you have, you try to protect it, but there's nothing you can do to kind of push it to the next level. No, because restaurants aren't that expensive to build. That's kind of your disadvantage. Restaurants are easy to build. New competitors come in. So Intel builds a new fab plant. Yeah, that's a huge advantage because that's $1 billion. A new store, I don't know, a new Chipotle they're probably renting space anyway. It's probably not that expensive, especially with franchises. You got individual people opening McDonald's. It's only $1 million or $2. So yeah. Reinvestment moats, these are strong moats, but they require a lot of reinvestment. So that's kind of where I would put Netflix, is that you got to spend so much money. It's a good moat. People go to it because you got this reputation, you got these shows no one else has. But boy, you got to spend so much money on these new programming over and over again. The best are the capital light compounders. These are economic moats. Usually it's a network effect. And your moat dominates a particular market. And because you dominate, you shut out competitors just because you dominate. It's that network effect. You're the place everybody goes. It's the Facebooks of the world kind of thing. Subscription based models, the first mover advantage kind of things. You don't have to spend that much, and it gives you a huge advantage. He gives, I can't remember the examples he gave, but he gave a few examples on the podcast. The capital firms he really loves. Great protection for competitors, but you don't have to reinvest. Capital light is important. One thing I don't like about airlines is they have to spend so much money on capital. New planes every year is just really expensive. And you almost have to do it because the planes are getting better, they're more efficient. You got to upgrade your fleet constantly. But boy, that's a lot of money. And so that's a really capital heavy, and I don't know if airlines have that many moats anyway. All right, questions in economic moats. So Porter's is paper 1. Porter's generic strategies is paper 1 and 2. Paper 1, how does the industry have cost leadership and differentiation? Paper 2, how does your firm differentiate itself? Economic moats is really paper 2, but you might think of it in terms of what are the strongest economic moats in your industry. You might bring that up. but these are all important kind of things. I'm gonna find that one guy. So it's on my Audible, excuse me, and I'm not checking my emails. I don't recommend this book because I didn't really like it, but it is an interesting concept. Just to show you how many people are copying Porter's. There it is. It's called 7 Powers by Helmer. Sounds like a mayonnaise, but 7 Powers by Helmer. He has his own website. So I might go through a few of these in a future class, just to show you. There's definitely some overlap with Porter's. The only reason I want to show it to you is one thing you're looking for as a college student. You notice what these templates do is they make sure you think of things that you might not have thought about anyway. And he has a couple of things in his list that I think broaden Porter's pretty well. You could probably fit them under Porter's, but they are different. They're unique. So economic moats gives you a little bit extra that you don't get from Porter's. Helmer's gives you a little bit extra. So I'll go through this. You can actually find his 7 factors are listed. There's websites that show them all. In fact, a lot better than to just do a list. So counter positioning, scale economics, switching costs, network economics, process power, branding, cornered resource. A couple of those are completely new things. Switching costs is the same. Scale economy, those are the same, but cornered resource, process power, counter positioning, those are 3 that are somewhat unique. So we may talk a little bit about those. What is he saying there? It may not apply to all of your firms, but one of those might be really unique to your firm and say, wow, that's something I want to bring into my paper. These are kind of things I'd be reading if I were you. Finance is, there's no one way to do it. And you're just looking for ideas of how to think about things, how to organize things. And the more of these kind of things you can bring into your interviews helps as well. So how did I figure this one out? I was listening to one of the business breakdowns and the guy goes, oh, I use Helmer 7 Powers. And interviewer goes, oh, yeah. I'm going, well, I never heard of that before. What is that? So I go out and buy the book. Not a great book. I don't recommend the book, but it was okay. I learned some stuff from it. But you could probably get everything you need just Wikipedia and just getting off the internet without having to read the book. So look for these kind of things. Find some edge that the key in finance, especially in investing, is you think slightly differently than everybody else, and it helps you find stuff no one else is thinking of. That's what these writers are doing. All right. So we might look at Jay's paper on Tuesday. You can change your mind, no pressure. But if anyone else wants to show your draft Tuesday or Thursday, let me know. Start looking at it. This weekend, so last weekend you got your outline. This weekend, start tackling pieces of the outline piece by piece by piece and get a good draft going. The paper's due in September, and guess what tomorrow is? So we're not that far away. All right, I'll stop it there.